So I'm going to be working, there we go. I'm going to be working with a company that specializes in that type of recruitment, both in Canada and the US.
Great. And I'm Julie Allworth. I work at the University of Toronto, where I'm the manager of an initiative called the Innovation Hub, and really grateful to be here with you today.
Okay. So before we get started, we wanted to acknowledge where we are speaking to you from. So I am speaking to you from London, Ontario, in Canada. And I acknowledge that I'm located on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoak, and Chenongton nations. And these are lands that are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum.
And I'm presenting today from my home in Milton, Ontario, Canada, which is part of Halton region. And Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today and I present to you from these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walk before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. I would personally like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. And if you have an interest in finding out where you live and work and whose territory, I think you can go to nativeland.ca. I think it covers the US as well, so we invite you to do that also. But let's dive into our presentation today. We are going to have a little bit of an audience participation throughout today. So we'd love to just kind of know who's in the room and ask a question of, what do you know about design thinking? From nothing to a lot. You don't have to answer it in detail. Just, what do you know about design thinking? Just so we can get a sense of who's in the room. So feel free to share your responses in the chat, and we'll just take a peek at what's coming through. Not much. Thanks, Rebecca. This is the first time I've heard of it. Okay, good. Thanks, Hannah. That's great. Very little, not a bunch. Okay, well, wonderful. Well, I'm so glad that you're
exciting
all at our session. This is our favorite topic to talk about, Leslie and I. Is it related to universal design for learning? Kind of, sort of, but not much. Oh, SALO, nonlinear process to accomplish solution to challenges. Yeah, let's see. So thanks for sharing that with us. That's great. I really appreciate your participation today. So today we're going to get into a bit of a design thinking overview. And we want to share with you a little bit about what design thinking is, and as Leslie said, how it applies to equity. We're going to save lots of time for questions at the end. If you have a burning question, feel free to put it in the chat. But at the end, I think we've saved quite a bit of time for some dialogue and questions. We'd be happy to answer them, chat more about design thinking and how it might apply in your context. So stay tuned for that. But let's dive right in. So there are a few things that I like to say about design thinking. And if it sort of encapsulates it into these two phrases. So the first is, design thinking is really about bringing people into the process. It's designing with people rather than for people. And in our context, this often means students, right? So how many times have I, as a staff person, been in a room of other staff people sitting around and talking about what students want or what students need? Design thinking takes a different approach to that. It's about bringing the people into the process. And this idea is that people support what they create. If we go to the next slide, you can imagine that when people are involved in designing solutions that meet their needs, the chances and the likelihood that those solutions are going to be supported are a lot greater. So those are sort of the two main things about design thinking, that if you remember nothing else, it's about designing with rather than for people, with this idea that people support what they create. So why is it human-centered? Well, it really, and you may have heard terms, design thinking is sort of used interchangeably with another term called human-centered design thinking. I use them interchangeably because really it starts with the people that we're designing for. And ideally, we hope that it ends with solutions that meet their needs. It's all about building deep empathy for what people really want and need, and ultimately using that data, that empathy gathered data, to better define the problem. And so we want to end up with a solution that's really desirable to the people in the circumstance, right? So in design thinking, we really think about who are our students and what do they need, and design from that place of solutions that are desirable to them, but will also be feasible and viable. So it's really all about people. And design thinking isn't for every problem. It's really best used for what I like to call wicked problems. And these are complicated, messy social systems problems that are difficult to solve for a lot of reasons. They're ambiguous, they're complex, they have a lot of sort of messy entanglements, a lot of different factors. Oftentimes there's many stakeholders and each of them have different values. And those are often in conflict with one another. There's no one solution to any wicked problem. When we think about wicked problems, we think about things like climate change, student mental health, right? These are not problems that have a clear solution. Design thinking is really well suited to approaching wicked problems with empathy so that we can better understand the people that experience these problems. And why do we talk about empathy? Well, empathy is really important in the work of design thinking because it's about understanding people. And we want to take a holistic view to this human-centeredness, right? Empathy is about understanding someone's whole worldview, not just the problems that they face and not just looking at the bad, but also the good, right? So not just understanding struggles, but also understanding the holistic experience of someone, right? And so how we do that in design thinking is by really empathizing with people, by talking to them, observing them. And we're going to get into some of the design thinking models that exist that help us to do this. And I will just say, before I talk about the models, that design thinking, it is a method. It's a method for innovation. It's a method for problem solving. But I think sometimes more importantly, it's also a mindset. So there's a way that we can think that's aligned in this human-centered design thinking way that really is about centering empathy. But I like to say this as a precursor. I'm going to dive into the models, and these we'll share our slides after. You can look into them more. They're really interesting to dive deeper into, but it isn't just a linear set of steps. It's also a mindset of really bringing people into the process. So the first model I'd like to share is the IDEO model. Now, IDEO is a design firm out in California. They were the original design thinkers, and they have this really simple model that begins with inspiration. Next goes to ideation and implementation. What I really like about the IDEO model is we have the inspiration is really fueling everything. And I love these sort of concentric, interconnected, ongoing circles because really it shows that the process isn't linear, right? We start with some inspiration from the data that we get that helps us generate ideas that can then be implemented. Probably the most well-known model of design thinking is the Stanford D-School model. This one is shown linear, but what I really like about this model is it puts empathy first, right? So we gather information, we empathize, we try to understand the problem, and then we define it. So the problem definition happens because of the data that we've gathered, right? So it's based on people's experiences of the problem, not how we would want to define it. And from there, we can ideate, prototype, and test. And I would say the main flaw in this model is that it isn't sort of circular, but it's linear, but it really never happens that way. So if we move on, the next model is the liberatory design model. And this could look familiar because you actually see Stanford's model in the middle there. Why we like this model is that it was a group of designers took the Stanford model and said, you know what, we need to infuse more equity principles. We need to be thinking about how we as designers are impacting the process. So they added this idea of notice and reflect. And you can really read more about this, but I will just say it's about thinking about ourselves and our own bias as we come into the process and noticing what our biases are going into that, but then also reflecting throughout the process of what our presence as designers in the process has even brought to the outcome of the project, basically how we're impacting the data and the research that's going into this, and ultimately the outcomes. Another great equity-centered model is called equity-centered community design. And what I really love about this model, it's out of the Creative Reaction Lab, and Antoinette Carroll, who leads that initiative, infused community development principles and equity principles with design thinking. So you see in the middle, she talks about having the scenario and first thinking about the history and the healing of the community, right? She said this thing, where, you know, she said she'll say things like, people's trauma won't leave their room just because they're prototyping, right? So it really acknowledges that a lot of these wicked problems have a lot of history and healing and trauma that are attached to them. And so with that also comes this idea of dismantling and acknowledging power constructs. And then around the outside, you can see something that looks sort of similar to the Stanford model, where it's about inviting the diverse co-creators. She talks about being an equity designer versus an equity ally. And if you're someone that has lived experience, you're the one that gets to be the designer. Otherwise, you're an ally. Building humility and empathy, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing. So again, the outside model is a little bit different, but the inner workings of it are really about that community development approach. So just to talk a little bit about design thinking methodology, I want to talk about how this type of problem solving is a little bit different from how we normally think about conventional problem solving. And I will just name that by human nature, we are all problem solvers. So when we see a problem, the first thing, our gut instinct is that we want to solve it. And design thinking says, whoa, wait a minute, let's hold up and let's actually steep ourselves in the problem so that we can really get to what's really going on. So the conventional approach that you can see here on this slide is that we go from a problem statement that might be based on someone's hunches or intuition. Maybe we have some studies, maybe we have some data, maybe there's student requests, but it's pretty top down how we define the problem, right? Usually people in power are defining the problem, and it's convergent thinking. And that takes us to a solution, right? Because we think we know what the answer is. So an example of this might be when students have added stress, when they were social distancing and there was anxiety associated with that, that someone might say, well, we should give virtual yoga classes. Well, no offense to yoga classes, that sounds like a great idea, but it is a bit of an oversimplification of the problem and what might be going on. So in design thinking, I actually think about solutions as being a dime a dozen. So if we go to the next slide, I've sort of tried to illustrate this, where every problem at its core, if we really understand the people that face the problem, we can actually discover through data, through that empathy gathering phase, when we talk to people, when we include them in the process, that there's a lot of unmet needs that are going on, right? So the solutions, as you can see here, are plentiful, right? It's really about getting to the need. So if we take the same example, students have added stress of social distancing and anxiety is associated with that. What do they really need? Is it that they need support? Stability, maybe they need connection, maybe there's something else going on. But when we get to that need and get to the really core need, that is the place where we want to design from. And if the need is for connection, then maybe virtual yoga classes aren't going to solve the problem, right? So we want to be problem solving from a needs-driven place, and that's what design thinking teaches us. So I'm going to pass it to Leslie now to talk a little bit more about storytelling.
Thanks so much, Julie. I could just listen to you talk about design thinking for hours. It's so great. I learned so much about design thinking from Julia. She's a fabulous teacher. So if you have any questions about going through the process and what it looks like on the ground, we're going to talk about some examples a little bit later, but Julia is a great contact for that. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about student affairs assessment and storytelling, and how design thinking can translate into systems we're already using to collect data, to develop learning outcomes, and to improve and justify the programming that we're doing. So one thing that's really important to understand is that storytelling is embedded in your work, whether you call it storytelling or not. So every time that you write a report, every time that you create a data visualization, every time you do anything where you're trying to mobilize your data and share it with someone for a purpose of change, which I would say is a lot of our job as assessment professionals, is change management. You're trying to craft a story to do that. And if we start to acknowledge that and understand that, humans are built to be storytelling machines and to absorb stories and share stories, once we understand that, we can actually intentionally tell stories to accomplish the changes that we need. And that relates to design thinking in a really important way that I'm going to go into. And the core of this is that we are not only storytelling machines, we're empathy machines. And so the fascinating thing about empathy is it's basically a superpower. Like, we watch all these Marvel movies and superhero movies about people who can, move things with their mind and do incredible things. Well, you have a system in your body that's pretty amazing, because when you watch somebody tell a story about something that's happened to them, and you can visually see and hear through the tone of their voice, you can see the emotions on their face, you can feel their energy. We take in that energy, and then you have a whole system in your brain. If you know about the neuroscience of learning, you have your limbic system and all your mirror neurons, and their whole job is to take what you see, emotions that you can see happening for others, and reproduce them in your own brain. So not only can you start to imagine and sympathize with people and imagine how they're feeling, you actually start to feel it too when you listen to their story. So that's really incredible, especially when you think about it from a change management standpoint, because change management is emotional. It's all about making sure people are supported in how they're feeling at different stages of change, individually and as a group. And so really harnessing and understanding how stories influence how people feel can take them along on a journey and help them understand the need for change, help them be motivated to adopt a necessary change, all of those kinds of things. So it's really important for us to understand storytelling is key to our work in assessment. And nowhere is it more evident than when you start looking at culture. So I don't know how many conferences I've been to where we talk about data and assessment and readiness for change, readiness for what the data is telling us. And that all has to do with culture. And all culture is a system of stories. So think of storytelling and stories as the programming language of culture. So you have stories that people share with each other, which builds their empathy and forms relationships. And then these groups of people start to believe that certain stories are true and are less likely to believe that other stories are true. And so you start to form a culture around a system of shared beliefs. And the interesting thing about that is that culture isn't just formed by stories, it then starts to create its own stories. So once you get adopted into a culture and you start to understand what that culture believes and what the norms are, you become a data point in that system that starts to produce similar stories. So we talk about confirmation bias, and people are, more likely to believe things they already believe are true. That's really the core of why culture shift is so difficult, because you have to tell powerful, disruptive stories to help people adopt a new system of beliefs before that culture can meaningfully shift. The interesting thing too is that the hardest stories to change are the ones we tell ourselves, and they're not the ones that we share openly. So culture change looks like it happens slow, and then fast. All of a sudden, it's totally different. And you can think of tons of different examples of how that's happened. Sometimes on a campus where there's been a flash in the pan, and it seems like everything has changed in one day. But in reality, it's because there's been a slow shift in beliefs over time because of a difference of stories that have been making their way through the culture. And then everybody is ready to acknowledge that a new story is true. And once that is publicly acknowledged, that's when you start to see the culture really shift really quickly. And it can feel very disorienting to people. So it's important that we understand that and we can start to tell those stabilizing stories. So how does this relate to assessment? Well, here's, kind of a blurry but typical assessment cycle. where we have, you have your divisional and departmental goals, you identify outcomes from those goals, whether they be learning outcomes or program outcomes. You connect those with your program services and learning opportunities. I always liked the language of this one, that you connect them with programs, because best practice is to create your outcomes before you build your programs, but the reality is that doesn't always happen. So sometimes we have to go back and kind of reverse engineer our outcomes. And then you start to gather your data from the assessments that you've designed to measure those outcomes. And then you review and interpret your assessment results. And then those interpretations inform your decisions and practices. And it's all beautiful, and it forms a nice loop that closes, and it should be an ever ongoing cycle of positive restlessness. The reality, though, is we don't often finish the cycle. So we're getting increasingly better at our goals and identifying the outcomes, creating surveys and designing data collection, and then gathering the data, and then we start to fall off in each successive step. So data goes and it sits in a drawer, nobody looks at it. Or there's one person who's responsible for that program who might pick it up and look at it, interpret it themselves, and then put it away, and then they don't get it out again the next time that they're designing that program, or the next time that they're revisiting their goals. And I started to wonder why. Why is it so hard to get us to close the loop? We are an empathetic field of people. We care about our students. Assessment is the most empathetic thing that we do, because it ensures that our work is not about us, but in fact about our students. So why do we have such a hard time using that data, which is given to us in a covenant of trust? The students give us the data in the expectation that we are going to use it to make their experience better. And so if we don't, we're breaking trust with our students. You're not student-centered unless you conduct assessment and close the loop. So why do we have such a hard time with it? Well, when I started learning about design thinking, I started feeling like, there's really something important missing from our assessment cycles, and it's empathy. So let's look back at the design thinking process, which is built around a core of empathy. And this is really where we're talking about, if we're talking about managing change, we're talking about using data in powerful ways, we have to talk about feelings. We have to talk about emotion. And those things have to play a really key role in how we collect data, what kind of data we collect, and how we package it to make sure that it's accomplishing what we put it out in the world to do. So I worked together with a few colleagues and created this revised assessment cycle that I've used at a couple of different institutions. And it's quite powerful because it's easier to sell to student affairs practitioners who sometimes resist assessment. As if it's quantitative and it's only numbers, it boils down our work to a point of simplicity that doesn't reflect all of the things that I do, and it's not capturing the richness of the work, and we're not going to make good decisions because it's not fulsome. So I can sell this a little easier to professionals who think that way, because this also gathers stories as data, and this gathers feelings and emotions, and it captures some of those intangible things that are at times difficult to really quantify in a survey. So empathy is the core of this assessment cycle. And then we move through the design thinking stages, defining our goals and outcomes, gathering the insights from those empathy stories, ideating, thinking of the most radical ways we could solve those problems so that we can converge on the right solution, prototyping and testing. We so rarely prototype in student affairs. Most of the time people say, oh, it's a prototype or it's a pilot. And really all it is it's a fully formed program, but maybe a bit smaller. A prototype is a representation that you get comments on before you actually create the thing. So it could be a storyboard. It could be a pitch meeting with students where you say, this is what we want to do. What do you think? So you really want to think about how you incorporate some of these stages in. It's not exactly the way that it comes across just in plain writing. Then we move into assessment, and then we added in this extra step of storytelling, because we often fail to share the story of our data with whoever our audiences are. So we may write a report and send it to a decision maker. I ask sometimes whether or not that's a powerful enough story. Is that a good story? Or do we share our data with the most important audience, the people who gave us the data? How do we craft stories and share the data back with our students? It's a really important thing to do, and we don't do it often enough. The interesting thing is if you do that, if you start to share the story of the data back with students, you can influence the next cycle of empathy. You can actually, that's the core of putting out an intentional story into your community to accomplish a change that you need. So this is why I believe very fervently in design thinking as an incorporated part of how we do our assessment in student affairs. It will help make our work better because it's centered around student needs, not our needs or experiences. Too often we're designing for students that we used to have or students that we wish we had, but not the students we have right now. And so to keep doing that, we have to focus on empathy for who is in our institutions at this moment. All right. Now we're going to move in and talk a little bit about equity and design thinking. So I'm going to open it up to the chat again and ask this question and maybe take a minute to think and feel free to start typing in responses. How can design thinking make education more equitable, just based on what Julia and I have been talking about so far? Maybe take a minute and think about what you've heard and how you think that might apply to equity. Emphasize positives. Interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about that? What do you mean by that? Including participants.
Okay, if I voice chat.
Oh yeah, of course.
I was just in another presentation that was talking about equity, and instead of asking students like, what's the barriers in your way, ask them, okay, you're the airplane that survived. Where are you getting shot? Or like, where are you not getting shot? Let's emphasize the positives and figure out, we don't need to put the armor on the airplane wings, we need it on the engines.
Interesting. Oh, there's a name. Oh, I'm blanking on the name, but yeah, no, there's a whole methodology around identifying what works for people. Storytelling can reflect lived experiences of students differently than numbers and coded data. Yes, yes. A lot of the times people talk about quantitative data as being, objective and better than qualitative data. And my response to that is neither one is perfect. Because quantitative data will never tell you why, and it can still be biased because there's still human hands handling that data. And then qualitative data is gonna tell you in detail why, but sometimes it's not quite as generalizable. So we need them to work together. Not the needs we think they have. Yes, so we're not focusing on our interpretation of people's experiences, but instead incorporating their real lived experiences into the process itself. Julia, you say this often, but you always talk to me about how design thinking is incredible in moving forward change because it's not about finding the right solution. The process itself changes people so that they're ready for the solution. And I just feel like that, I feel that right in my heart because that's really the core of why this works.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to rocket through these equity slides. Just because we've summed up a little bit in how we've talked about design thinking about why this works, but we want to make sure everybody had a clear understanding what we're talking about when we discuss equity. So when we're talking about equity, we really mean that every person receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. And there's a number of different illustrations that illustrate this concept, but here's one, and it showcases, a lot of the times we approached equity from an equality kind of standpoint where everybody gets the same thing. And the reality is that not everybody needs the same thing. Sometimes people need something different so that they have the same access. And it's really important to acknowledge that, for example, if we have students with disabilities who need specific accommodations, that doesn't give them an advantage in, say, a classroom. That's what they need to be able to succeed the same way that their classmates can, because they face additional barriers. And so that's a really important dimension to think of when we're talking about equity. It's not the same as equality. And when we talk about diversity and equity are different because diversity just is. We're different. There's lots of different people from different places that come together. Equity is the act of making sure everyone has access to the spaces they should be at, are at the tables, are part of decisions. we also wanted to talk a little bit about reflexivity and make sure that everybody had heard this word and kind of understood where we were coming from when we talk about this, because it has to be part of a good design thinking process. And reflexivity is the process by which the researcher reflects on data collection and the interpretation process. So it's a term from sociology, and it's basically refers to the fact that data collected and the interpretation process isn't objective, and it's shaped by the researcher's positionality. And so I did my undergraduate degree in biology, and the number of times that I ever saw anything about the person who conducted research on the papers I was reading I never saw that. I never understood what the context of the researcher in those papers were. And that's a problem. Whether that's a biology paper or a sociology paper, we should understand the context of the researcher, because they bring that context to their interpretation and how they research the content that they're looking at. So we just have to understand that we are not neutral. We have an impact on the stories that we gather and the stories that we share. And that goes for the data that we collect as well. So we really, really need to build our self-awareness of our biases. I know that there's nothing worse than, say, for example, being told that you're racist. The reality is we live in a racist system. So if you are somebody who embodies a privilege within that system, then you participate in the racist system, whether intentionally or not. And so we just have to start getting cool with being like, yes, I am a little bit racist because I benefit from the racist system that is sometimes invisible to me. And that doesn't make me a bad person, but I need to work hard to be aware of those biases so that I can also be part of deconstructing them. And so that's especially important when we look at design thinking, because design thinking on its own can't solve equity unless you bring the good lenses to the design with you. And that's the self-awareness that we're talking about there. So basically, wicked problems are very, very wicked indeed. And this is a kind of example of how the individual and systemic oppressions can overlap and be part of the processes we go through to try and solve these wicked problems. So there's many levels and dynamics that reproduce and sustain systemic oppression. And oppression is a big problem that we've been talking about a lot more, I'd say, in the last 5 years even. The pandemic, I think, has escalated the urgency with which we need to have this conversation. And design thinking can be a tool to start to address that. So again, design thinking, is it the solution for inequity? Not on its own. Design thinking can't solve these problems because we have to solve the problems. We can use design thinking as a tool and shift our mindset to think more with an empathetic lens and think more from the lens, from the standpoint and perspective of the people who we are trying to create things for. But we have to actively work to solve inequity. And that means taking time to educate yourself on a number of different theories and best practices out there, to take time and reflect on your own biases and how they may or may not be influencing things you do in your work and even in your personal life. And so you can use participatory design to help you identify those biases and to help you start to question and introduce new perspectives into that echo chamber we sometimes find ourselves in, to make sure that we're actually serving the students that we intend to. And then think carefully about, when you do a design thinking process, who makes the final decision and how is that decision made? So if you go through a whole participatory process and bring everybody in and they all come up with a solution, do they make the final decision? Because if they don't, then you run the risk of having gone through a great process, but still making an inequitable decision if the person making the decision also doesn't have those equity lenses and isn't paying specific attention to the participation that took place. Okay, we have a few examples. Maybe as we run through and talk about these, we can chat a little too and see if there's any questions that come in.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's important that we share with you some examples just so you can see this in action, right? We've talked a lot about today. We'll try to fly through because we did promise to leave some time for questions. I realize we're less than 10 minutes away from the wrap up, but I want to share two from University of Toronto context. One is the Presidential and Provostial Task Force on Student Mental Health at University of Toronto. They called upon my student team at the Innovation Hub to bring design thinking into these really complex mental health challenges. So we did, unfortunately, at U of T over the years have a couple of very public student deaths, and mental health was a real focus, as it is across the board. But there was a lot of sort of demands from students that this be paid attention to, right? And so they called on us to take the design thinking approach when it came to having dialogue with students about their experience of mental health on campus, what their needs were, how those were being met. And we did this in group dialogue sessions. And actually it became really interesting because in this dialogue with students, we found that that was actually part of the healing that was needed to just start to talk to each other. So it's amazing to me how when done in group formats, the data collection of empathy can actually be healing for the participants, which was really insightful. In the end, we had a report that's actually publicly available on U of T's website of the recommendations from the Mental Health Task Force. A lot of those were driven from our design thinking work, and it did lead to a partnership with the Canadian Mental Health Association and a lot of other initiatives that are really working actually very nicely. And luckily, this was done right before the pandemic, and a lot of the recommendations started to be implemented during the pandemic. Another quite different example is an example we call chill spots. So in the first year of the Innovation Hub, we were looking broadly at the campus and what some of the students' needs were. And we're on an 80,000 student, largely commuter campus. And what we found was that there wasn't enough space on campus for students to just chill, right? They had a lot of time between classes, they were commuting, they needed to heat up their lunch. And so our team, through these needs, proposed an idea for chill spots where underutilized spaces could be repurposed to a place for students to just chill and just be. And actually, the provost put quite a big budget into folks who would want to submit applications to design these spaces. And now many millions of dollars have been spent in creating these spaces, and they're just starting to pop up all over campus, and they're really, really going to change the student experience. So a number of stipulations came out of that too, that they had to be open access for all students, and a lot of the sort of the needs that we found in the design research really came to fruition. And I think Leslie has one more example.
Yeah, I wanted to give a little bit of a different example. This one is not student facing, it's staff facing. So when I was at Ryerson University, we had a team called Ryerson Student Affairs Creative, and they were basically like an internal ad agency to bring consistency and kind of equity to the materials produced for different programs and parts of the department. So we had a team of multimedia specialists who built websites and created brochures and designed all of the things to look really nice. So the staff would put in a form basically to request a project, and the form asked for a number of different pieces of information. And what we were finding was that there was a bit of a breakdown happening between the team and then all of the other staff who were requesting projects. And the team got a reputation for being unapproachable. And there started to be some conflicts that arose when somebody would request something, it would be really urgent, and then the team would be really stressed out trying to produce it. They would provide something and it wouldn't have been what the person was looking for. So we wanted to sit down and kind of dig into that, and we were just learning about design thinking, and we decided to do a design thinking process to really dig into the problem and understand what the solution needed to be. And so we did kind of a half-day retreat with a number of staff who are regular project requesters. And one of the first things we did was we got them to all sit down and do an autoethnography project on their biggest challenges at work, and to tell stories about like what are the biggest things that worry them or the biggest challenges they're facing and in their work. So they each sat down and told those stories, and then we did a facilitated post-it exercise where they walked around and they kind of gave some thoughts and feedback and information about different stages of projects, successful projects they wish had happened differently, so that we could gather all of that information while we were in the room with people. Out of that process, we created a couple of personas of staff from aggregated autoethnographies and from some of the patterns that came out of the post exercise. And what we started to find was that, there was just a fundamental breakdown in empathy between our team and the clients, the other staff that they were serving. And what ended up changing was the process. So rather than starting the process for requesting a project with a form, every single request had to begin with at least 10-minute meeting, possibly 30 minutes. And so you would put in your form and basically indicate when you were available to meet. And then you would meet together and fill out the form together to find out exactly what you needed. And what resulted was a more human connection, an improvement of that relationship. And it solved a lot of the problems that we saw come out of the design program. And we went through like a complicated ideation too, to try and figure out if we could improve the form and how we could change other parts of the process. And the result was that we had data that, relationships improved, and there were marked formal and informal ways that we could see that relationship really, really improving. So it's not only a process that you have to apply to student creation, you can also use it to deal with issues that you're seeing within your staff culture. Because again, even going through the process itself, the process became a tool to improve the relationship because it showed that we were invested. Okay, so that gives us a couple of minutes, I think.
Yeah,
Really,
2 minutes left.
We'll be around too if you have any questions. But we wanted to make sure that there was some time for you to ask any questions you had.
So I think we have time for one question, and maybe while they're thinking about that, maybe put your email in the chat, people to copy so they can contact you.
I think we have a last slide too with some information, right, Leslie?
Yes, we do.
So any question? Does anybody have a question before we leave?
So here are our emails, and if you want to learn more about this, we wrote a book. So you can find the book online. If you go to Stylus, there's a code there that we put in at the bottom so that you can get 20% off. And the book really goes through in detail how a process like this can work in the context of higher education, and how it relates to some of the assessment practices that we've been using.
All right, great. And I think Gavin is probably going to have you give him the slides so he can make them available to everybody. So they'll have your addresses and things on there too.
Yeah, reach out. We'd love to talk about all of this. So we're happy to hear from you.
All right, awesome. Thank you. This was really informative and exciting, actually, to listen to.
Thank you.
So I hope people will contact you and
Please do. We love to hear from people.
All right, great. All right, thank you, everybody. It's been a great day. We appreciate that you spent the time with us, and we will see you again next year.
Thanks, everyone.
everybody.
All right, thanks.
Bye now.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.